They were mocked for living in a crumbling rain shelter on the edge of town, dismissed as the crazy old couple too stubborn to accept charity. But when the concrete wall finally cracked open, what Harold and Martha found inside wasn't just a hidden room. It was a secret worth $230 million that would silence every person who ever looked down on them. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The rain shelter sat like a forgotten gravestone at the far edge of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, where the paved roads gave way to gravel and the streetlights stopped trying. It was a squat concrete structure built in 1962, part of some civil defense program that never quite took off, designed to house families during storms or emergencies that rarely came. The walls were thick, reinforced, meant to withstand tornadoes and nuclear fallout that never arrived. Over the decades, it had become a relic, then an eyesore, then finally, a home for two people nobody wanted to think about. Harold and Martha Brennan had lived there for 7 years. 7 long years that felt like a lifetime, and a blink all at once. Harold was 73 now, his shoulders still broad despite the stoop that age had carved into his spine like water wearing down stone. His hands were weathered, scarred from decades of carpentry work, each callous and crooked finger a testament to a lifetime of honest labor that had once earned him respect and a comfortable living. His hair had gone completely white, but his eyes remained sharp, the pale blue of a winter sky, capable of measuring a piece of wood to the 16th of an inch just by looking. Martha was 71, silver-haired and soft-spoken, with eyes that carried both deep kindness and a bone-tired sadness that no amount of rest could cure. She wore the same 3 dresses in rotation. All of them mended so many times the original fabric was hard to distinguish from the patches. One was a faded floral print she'd bought at a church rummage sale for $2. Another was plain navy blue, donated by a neighbor who'd moved away. The third was a light gray cotton that had once been white, worn thin at the elbows and hem. She rotated them religiously, washing one while wearing another, hanging them on a line strung between the shelter and a dead oak tree that stood like a sentinel in the otherwise barren lot. The shelter itself was maybe 800 square feet of unforgiving concrete. One large room with a ceiling barely 7 feet high, making Harold duck whenever he moved too quickly. They had running water, a blessing they never took for granted, from a single spigot that coughed and sputtered, but delivered something drinkable if you let it run for 30 seconds first. The pipes groaned in the walls like ghosts whenever the temperature dropped. They had electricity too. One outlet that powered a hot plate, a lamp with a crooked shade, and on cold nights, a small space heater that never quite warmed the whole space no matter where they positioned it. They'd divided the space with hanging blankets, creating what they called rooms, though the word was generous. One area served as their bedroom, barely large enough for the twin mattresses they'd pushed together and covered with donated quilts. Another section was the kitchen, if you could call a hot plate on a folding table and a mini-fridge humming in the corner a kitchen. The rest was their living space, furnished with a salvaged couch that sagged in the middle, a wooden crate serving as a coffee table, and 2 folding chairs they'd found behind the Methodist church on trash day. The concrete walls wept with condensation in summer, moisture running down in rivulets that pooled on the floor and required constant mopping. In winter, those same walls froze to the touch, so cold that Martha had learned to hang blankets over them, creating a buffer of air that helped trap what little heat the space heater provided. The floor was uneven, cracked in places where tree roots had pushed up from below, and they'd covered the worst spots with scrap carpet and cardboard, anything to keep the cold from seeping up through their shoes. But it was theirs. Or at least, it was all they had. Millbrook wasn't cruel by nature, but it wasn't particularly kind either. It was the sort of small Pennsylvania town where everyone knew everyone else's business, which meant everyone also knew everyone's failures, their falls from grace, their most humiliating moments. And Harold and Martha's fall had been spectacular in its quiet, devastating completeness. They'd once owned a home on Maple Street, a modest two-story colonial with yellow vinyl siding, and a front porch where Martha grew tomatoes in terracotta pots every summer. The kitchen had checkered curtains she'd sewn herself. The living room had a fireplace they used on Christmas Eve. The backyard had a workshop where Harold kept his tools organized on pegboards, each one in its proper place, each one cleaned after every use. They'd raised 2 children there, Daniel and Rebecca, both now living states away, busy with careers and families that left little room for aging parents who'd lost everything. Harold had run his own carpentry business for 42 years. Brennan Woodworks, building custom cabinets, refinishing hardwood floors, restoring old homes with a craftsman's careful attention to detail. People used to wait months for his services. He'd been known throughout 3 counties as the man who could match any wood grain, who could repair a banister so seamlessly you'd never know it had been broken, who took pride in every joint and every finish. His reputation had been built on decades of quality work, fair prices, and showing up when he said he would. Martha had worked too, part-time at the elementary school library, helping children find books, reading stories during lunch periods, organizing the annual book fair that the whole town looked forward to. She'd known every child's name, remembered which ones loved horses, which ones preferred dinosaurs, which ones needed gentle encouragement to try reading something challenging. The teachers had loved her. The principal had called her indispensable. They'd lived modestly but comfortably. They'd taken 1 vacation a year, usually to visit Daniel in Ohio or Rebecca in Maryland. They'd had a savings account, not much, but enough to feel secure. They'd had health insurance through Harold's business. They'd had a life that felt solid, built on decades of hard work and careful planning. And then Martha got sick. It started with fatigue she attributed to age, then pain she tried to ignore, then a lump she finally couldn't pretend wasn't there. Breast cancer, stage 3 by the time they caught it. The treatment was aggressive: surgery, chemotherapy, radiation. Martha survived, beating the cancer back into remission, but the cost was staggering. Their insurance covered some of it, but the deductibles, the co-pays, the experimental treatments, the insurance denied, the medications that cost hundreds of dollars per pill, it all added up faster than Harold could earn it. He took on more work, accepting jobs he would have normally turned down, working 12-hour days, then 14-hour days, sacrificing quality for quantity because they needed the money now, not when the project was perfect. His reputation began to suffer. Clients complained about delays, about work that wasn't up to his usual standards. New customers stopped calling. Old customers went elsewhere. At the same time, the big box stores moved in. Home Depot opened on the highway. Lowe's followed 6 months later. Suddenly people could buy pre-made cabinets for a fraction of what Harold charged for custom work. They could get flooring installed by contractors who worked for corporate rates. Harold couldn't match. His business, already struggling, began to fail in earnest. Then came the loan. A friend of a friend knew a lender who specialized in helping small businesses through rough patches. The terms seemed reasonable at first glance. Harold, desperate and exhausted, and not thinking clearly, signed the papers without reading every line, without fully understanding the variable interest rate, the balloon payment due after 3 years, the clauses that allowed the lender to claim his house as collateral. It was predatory lending at its worst, designed to trap people who were already drowning. By the time Harold understood what he'd signed, it was too late. The interest rate had doubled. The payments became impossible to meet. He tried to refinance, but his credit was shot from the medical bills. He tried to negotiate with the lender, but they had no interest in negotiation when they could simply take the house and sell it for 3 times what Harold owed. Foreclosure came like a thief in the night. Legal and merciless, and absolutely final. They had 90 days to vacate. 90 days to pack up 47 years of marriage, to sort through a lifetime of accumulated belongings, to decide what fit in a storage unit they could barely afford, and what had to be left behind or sold for pennies on the dollar. Their children offered help, but it came with conditions that felt like ultimatums. Daniel suggested a retirement community in Ohio where he could keep an eye on them. Martha would have her own small apartment. Harold would have access to a woodshop. They'd have activities and meals provided. It sounded nice, Daniel said. Dignified. Safe. What he didn't say but they heard anyway was controllable, manageable, out of sight. Rebecca offered to convert her garage into a small living space. But she had 3 young children and a husband who traveled for work, and Martha knew what that meant. They'd be babysitters who occasionally slept in the garage. They'd be live-in help who were supposed to be grateful for a roof over their heads. Rebecca meant well, Martha was sure of that. But the offer came with invisible strings that would have slowly strangled them. So Harold and Martha chose differently. They chose the only thing that felt like it was truly theirs, even if it was nothing. They'd found the abandoned rain shelter through Harold's cousin Frank, who worked in the county assessor's office. It was county property, technically condemned, deemed unfit for habitation back in 1998, when an inspection had found structural concerns that were never addressed because the county had no budget for demolition, and no buyer wanted to invest in land that came with a concrete liability. So it sat, empty and forgotten, gathering graffiti and broken beer bottles from teenagers who used it as a party spot, until even that got boring. Frank had mentioned it casually over coffee, not really suggesting it as a solution but more as a point of conversation. You know that old civil defense shelter out past Miller Road? County still owns it, but nobody gives a damn what happens to it anymore. Harold had driven out there the next day. The place looked terrible, covered in spray paint, windows long gone, door hanging crooked on rusted hinges, but the bones were solid. Reinforced concrete didn't care about neglect. The roof didn't leak. The walls stood firm. He'd cleaned it out over the course of 2 weeks, hauling out trash bags full of beer cans, cigarette butts, used condoms, broken glass, the detritus of other people's forgotten nights. He'd scrubbed the graffiti with borrowed chemicals and a wire brush until his hands bled. He'd salvaged plywood from a construction site to cover the window openings. He'd sweet-talked the county into turning the electricity and water back on, claiming he was the new property manager conducting an assessment, a lie that bothered him but not enough to stop. They'd moved in with 2 suitcases, a box of photographs they couldn't bear to leave behind, and their dignity, bruised but still intact. No one knew at first. Then someone saw Harold's truck parked there. Then a neighbor drove past and recognized Martha hanging laundry. Word spread the way it always does in small towns, through whispers at the grocery store, through phone calls between friends, through the kind of gossip that people insist isn't gossip but concern. The town noticed. Oh, the town noticed everything. At Ferguson's grocery store, Martha would overhear whispers that weren't quite whispered enough as she compared prices on day-old bread. She'd learned to shop late, after 7 in the evening when the store was almost empty, and the whispers were fewer, but they still happened. That's her, isn't it? Martha Brennan. The one living in that concrete box, out past Miller Road. I heard she turned down help from her own children. Can you imagine? Quote, too proud, I suppose. Pride goeth before a fall. Isn't that what they say? Well, she's certainly fallen. Did you see those clothes? That dress has more patches than original fabric. Martha had learned to keep her eyes down, to move quickly through the aisles, to pretend her hearing wasn't as good as it actually was. She'd learned that engaging only made it worse, that defending yourself against pity and judgment was like arguing with the rain. It didn't change anything, and you just ended up more soaked. At Dalton's hardware store, Harold endured different but equally painful interactions. At least the men were more direct, less likely to whisper behind his back and more likely to offer charity that felt more like condescension wrapped in concern. Harry, Old Man Dalton would say, using a nickname Harold had never liked. We got some day-old bread in the back if you need it. No shame in accepting help when you're down on your luck. Or worse. Heard you're living out at that old shelter. That's temporary though, right? Just until you get back on your feet. County's got programs, you know. Social services can help folks like you. Folks like you. As if poverty was a category, a species, something that defined you completely and erased everything you'd been before. Harold had learned to smile tightly, to decline politely, to finish his business, and leave before the pity became unbearable. He'd learned that accepting help, even when desperately needed, came with invisible debts, with expectations of gratitude that felt more like submission. The worst part, the part that kept both of them awake on cold nights when the space heater couldn't quite push back the chill, was that Millbrook didn't see them anymore. Not really. People saw only the surface. An elderly couple living in a concrete box, clearly unable to care for themselves, obviously making poor choices, definitely too proud to accept the help they so clearly needed. No one saw Harold's craftsmanship, the way he'd carefully reinforced their hanging blanket walls so they wouldn't sag, the ingenious shelving system he'd built from salvaged wood. No one saw Martha's resilience, the way she made their tiny space feel like a home with small touches, a jar of wildflowers on their makeshift table, curtains she'd sewn from donated fabric to cover the plywood windows, her constant efforts to maintain dignity in a place designed to strip it away. They'd become invisible in their poverty, visible only as objects of pity or mild disgust, present only as reminders of what could happen if you weren't careful, if you made bad choices, if you ended up on the wrong side of luck and circumstance. Children were warned not to go near the shelter. Parents used them as cautionary tales during lectures about education and hard work. You see those Brennans? That's what happens when you don't plan for the future. That's what happens when you're too proud to accept help. Teenagers dared each other to knock on the door and run, turning their poverty into entertainment. One Halloween, someone had spray-painted Hobo Hotel across the front of the structure in bright orange letters that seemed to glow in the dark. Harold had spent an entire cold morning scrubbing it off with borrowed chemicals and sheer determination, his arthritic hands cramping with the effort, while Martha stood inside crying quietly where he couldn't hear. But the absolute worst was Sunday. the Brennans still attended St. Michael's Catholic Church, sitting in the back pew during the 8 o'clock Mass, wearing their cleanest clothes that still somehow looked dingy under the sanctuary's fluorescent lights. They sang the hymns, their voices soft but steady. They bowed their heads during prayers, the same prayers they'd prayed for 49 years of marriage. They took communion, receiving the wafer and wine with the same reverence they always had, as if poverty hadn't diminished their worthiness of grace. They left before coffee hour because the pitying glances and carefully averted eyes were harder to bear than hunger. Because watching people they'd known for decades suddenly become interested in the bulletin board whenever Martha approached was more painful than cold concrete under their feet. Because being treated like ghosts in a building where they'd once belonged felt like dying slowly, publicly, without the mercy of actual death. One Sunday, a woman named Susan Pritchard had cornered Martha in the parking lot. Susan was 62. Well-meaning in the way that often causes the most harm, active in every church committee, known for her casseroles and her inability to keep other people's business private. "Martha, dear," she'd said, one hand on Martha's arm, voice dripping with concerned kindness. "We've been talking, the ladies and I, and we think it would be best if you and Harold considered the county shelter program. What you're doing out there, living in that place, it's not safe. It's not dignified." Martha had smiled, that sad, patient smile she'd perfected over 7 years of being pitied. "Thank you, Susan. But we're managing just fine." "But Martha, you're living in a rain shelter, a condemned building. Surely you can see how that reflects on, well, on all of us." There it was. The truth crystallized in that moment like ice forming on a window. It wasn't concern for Harold and Martha's well-being. It was embarrassment. The Brennans' visible poverty made Millbrook uncomfortable. Their refusal to disappear into some institutional solution made the good people of St. Michael's look bad, made them confront the reality that their charity had limits, that their compassion extended only as far as it was convenient. Harold had appeared then, taking Martha's hand, leading her to their battered pickup truck, without a word. The truck was 24 years old, held together by prayers and Harold's mechanical ingenuity, rust eating holes in the fenders, the muffler held up with wire hangers. They'd driven home in silence. The kind of silence that holds everything you can't say out loud, everything that would break you if you let it out. But they endured. They'd learned how to survive on almost nothing, developed routines that gave structure to days that might otherwise collapse under the weight of their circumstances. Harold picked up odd jobs, cash under the table, fixing fences for farmers who paid him $40 for 8 hours of work because they knew he'd take it. He patched roofs, cleared brush, helped people move, did anything that didn't require insurance or licenses or the kind of reputation he no longer had. Some weeks he made $100. Some weeks he made $30. Once, memorably, he'd made $250 when a contractor needed emergency help on a deck project and was willing to overlook Harold's lack of current insurance. Martha cleaned houses for 3 families in the wealthier part of town, scrubbing toilets and mopping floors and dusting shelves, while the owners complained about the economy over wine that cost more than the Brennans spent on food in a week. She was paid $10 an hour, in cash, and she was grateful for it, even though it barely covered their propane for the space heater and the electric bill that seemed to climb every month despite their careful rationing. They ate simply, making every dollar stretch as far as it could go. Oatmeal for breakfast, 39 cents a pound when bought in bulk, peanut butter and day-old bread for lunch, soup and more bread for dinner. The kind of soup you could make with whatever vegetables were cheapest, whatever meat was on clearance, a 50-cent can of tomato paste to make it seem more substantial. They shopped at the discount grocery store 2 towns over where no one knew them, where Martha didn't have to endure pitying looks while comparing generic brands. They collected rainwater in barrels. Harold had scavenged from behind a restaurant, using it to wash their clothes. And I won consensus, hanging them on the line regardless of weather, because the laundromat charged $3.50 per load, and they couldn't justify the expense. They read library books by lamplight. 1 lamp because electricity cost money. They listened to a transistor radio for company, the batteries lasting months because they turned it on only during news and turned it off immediately after. They held each other on cold nights when the space heater wasn't enough, when even layered blankets couldn't quite keep the concrete cold at bay, and they pretended this was temporary, that someday, somehow, things would change even though they both knew better. What kept them going wasn't hope exactly, but something quieter, more stubborn, more essential. Harold had survived Korea, had come home with shrapnel still in his leg and nightmares that took years to fade. Martha had survived breast cancer, had endured chemotherapy that felt like dying, and radiation that burned her skin, had emerged scarred but alive. They'd buried their youngest daughter, Sarah, in 1987, lost to a drunk driver 3 weeks before her 20th birthday. And they'd survived that too, though the grief still ambushed them at unexpected moments. They'd weathered 49 years of marriage with all its joys and sorrows, all its triumphs and disasters. This was just another storm, longer and colder than most, but they'd learned long ago how to wait out storms. You put your head down. You hold on to what matters. You take one day at a time because that's all you can carry. It was early November, the 3rd of the month, when Harold first noticed the crack. Not a new crack, he realized later, but one he'd simply never paid attention to before. He'd been sweeping the floor that morning, a ritual he performed every day, not because it made much difference in a concrete box, but because routine mattered when so little else did, because maintaining standards mattered even when no one else cared. The broom handle caught on something, a raised edge near the back wall he'd never noticed in 7 years of living there. He stopped, frowning, and knelt down despite his knees protesting the movement. He ran his fingers along the concrete floor where it met the wall. There was a seam, barely visible, maybe 1/8 of an inch wide, running vertically from floor to ceiling for about 6 feet. He traced it with growing curiosity, his carpenter's hands recognizing something wrong, something intentional. The concrete on one side was slightly different in texture and color, as if it had been patched or added later, as if 2 separate construction projects had met, but not quite matched. He tapped the wall with his knuckles, first on one side of the seam, then the other. The sound was different, not dramatically, but enough. The left side sounded solid, dense, exactly what you'd expect from reinforced concrete. The right side sounded slightly hollow, as if there was space behind it, as if the concrete here was thinner or backed by something other than solid earth. "Martha," he called, his voice carrying a note of excitement he hadn't felt in months. She emerged from behind the blanket that sectioned off their sleeping area, wiping her hands on her apron, hair tied back with a rubber band. "What is it?" "I'm not sure." "Feel this." He guided her hand along the seam, showed her the subtle difference in texture. Martha frowned, running her fingers over the concrete with the same careful attention she'd once used helping children find books in the library. "It's smoother here, on this side." almost like it was finished separately, like it wasn't part of the original construction. Harold stood, his mind working through 42 years of construction experience, decades of examining buildings and understanding how they were put together. This shelter was built in 1962 according to the county records. Standard civil defense design, reinforced concrete walls, single large room, ventilation system, basic emergency supplies storage. He gestured around their familiar space. But this section, this back wall, it doesn't match. The concrete is newer, or at least mixed differently. I'd bet money on it. What are you saying? I'm saying someone sealed something off after the original construction. Maybe there's storage space we didn't know about. Some kind of closet or supply room. Could be useful. They spent the rest of that day examining the wall with new eyes, tapping every square foot, measuring, looking for any sign of an entrance or a weakness or an explanation. Harold fetched his old level from the workshop corner, checking if the wall was truly vertical or if there was any bulge or irregularity that might indicate a door frame. Martha brought their measuring tape, and they discovered the interior dimensions of the shelter didn't match the exterior footprint, that there was roughly 12 feet of space unaccounted for behind that suspicious wall. As the sun set and their single lamp cast long shadows across the concrete floor, Martha made soup, the thin vegetable kind that was more broth than substance, while Harold sat on their makeshift couch and stared at the wall like it might give up its secrets through sheer force of will. That night, lying in their pushed-together twin beds under layers of donated quilts, Harold couldn't stop thinking about the wall. He ran through possibilities in his mind. Maybe it was just a structural thing. Reinforcement added later. Maybe the original builders had made a mistake and covered it up. Maybe there really was a storage space, and some previous occupant had sealed it off. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something more. He dreamed that night of walls within walls, of spaces hidden and forgotten, of secrets sealed in concrete and time, waiting patiently for someone to finally ask the right question, to finally notice what had been overlooked for 61 years. The next morning, Harold made a decision. He'd spent 7 years being careful, being small, making do with what little they had. Just this once, he wanted to break something open instead of patching it closed. Just this once, he wanted to satisfy his curiosity instead of being practical and prudent and resigned. He drove his protesting truck to a construction site where he'd worked a few odd jobs the previous month. The foreman, a younger man named Rick, who'd always treated Harold with basic human respect, was in the trailer drinking coffee when Harold knocked. "Morning, Harry. Need some work?" "Actually, I need to borrow a sledgehammer." Rick raised his eyebrows but didn't ask questions. He walked Harold to the equipment shed and handed over a 10-pound sledge. "Bring it back when you're done. No rush." Back at the shelter, Harold stood before the suspicious wall, sledgehammer in hand, feeling slightly ridiculous, slightly reckless, and more alive than he'd felt in months. Martha watched from the doorway, arms crossed, her expression unreadable but not disapproving. "You're sure about this?" she asked. "Not even a little bit," Harold admitted. "But I've been staring at this wall for 7 years, and I never noticed that seam until yesterday. That means something. It might mean nothing. It might mean we end up with a hole in the wall and no way to fix it. No materials to repair it. Then we'll hang another blanket over it. We're good at making do." He positioned himself, testing the weight of the hammer, feeling the familiar pull of old muscles, remembering how to work. "I've spent 7 years being careful, Martha. Being small. Making do with less and less. Just once, just this one time, I'd like to break something open instead of accepting what I'm given. She understood. She'd always understood him in ways that went deeper than words. Without saying anything else, she stepped beside him and placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch conveying support, permission, partnership. Then swing, she said quietly. The first blow sent shockwaves up Harold's arms and a spray of concrete dust into the cold November air. A small divot appeared in the wall. Nothing dramatic, just a chip maybe 2 inches across. But it was a start. He swung again, finding the rhythm his body remembered from decades of demolition work, from tearing out old walls to make way for new construction. Each impact chipped away a little more, revealing layers beneath layers, the concrete crumbling like old secrets finally giving way. After 20 minutes, sweating despite the November chill seeping through every crack in their shelter, Harold paused to catch his breath. His shoulders burned. His hands ached. But the hole was maybe a foot across now, jagged and rough, deep enough to see darkness beyond. He peered into it, squinting, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Hand me the flashlight," he said, his voice tight with something between excitement and apprehension. Martha fetched it from their small cache of emergency supplies, a heavy maglite they'd bought at a yard sale for $3. Harold clicked it on and aimed the beam into the hole. The light disappeared into a space beyond, revealing nothing but shadows and the glint of something he couldn't quite identify. Not pipes, not insulation, something smooth, metallic maybe, reflecting the light back at odd angles. "There's definitely a room back there," he said, his heart beginning to pound harder than it had from the physical exertion. A whole sealed-off space. A room? In a rain shelter? That doesn't make sense. I told you. This wall was added later. Someone built this shelter according to the county's civil defense specifications, then came back and sealed off a section. But why? He set down the flashlight and picked up the sledgehammer again. Only one way to find out. They worked together then, falling into the kind of coordinated efficiency that comes from 49 years of partnership. Harold would swing until his arms gave out. Then Martha would clear away the debris, sweeping concrete chunks and dust into a pile, pulling larger pieces free by hand. Then Harold would swing again, enlarging the opening inch by inch, foot by foot. They didn't speak much. Both of them focused, both sensing that whatever lay beyond that wall was going to change something fundamental about their understanding of this place they'd called home for 7 years. By midday, the hole was large enough for Harold to squeeze through if he turned sideways. He paused at the threshold, suddenly aware that whatever was beyond that wall had been hidden intentionally, sealed away for a reason, kept secret for decades. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the flashlight again. "Be careful," Martha said, her voice carrying an edge of worry he rarely heard. She was thinking of structural integrity, of Harold climbing through a hole in a wall that might collapse, of losing him to some stupid accident in their desperate concrete home. He nodded, understanding her fear, sharing it. "I will. Just want to see what's there before we make this hole any bigger." He climbed through carefully, flashlight in one hand, the other braced against the rough edge of broken concrete. His body protested the awkward movement, 73-year-old joints complaining loudly, but he managed to squeeze through into the darkness beyond. The space was smaller than the main shelter, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, but it felt vast in its strangeness. The walls here were finished differently, smooth, painted once though the paint had faded and water-stained over the decades. The ceiling was lower, barely 6 feet, forcing Harold to stoop slightly. His flashlight beam swept across the space, catching motes of dust disturbed for the first time. Who knew how many years, and against the far wall, covered in a heavy tarp, so grey with dust it looked like stone, were shapes, rectangular shapes of different sizes, stacked and leaning, at least a dozen of them clearly visible, maybe more behind. Harold approached slowly, each step deliberate, feeling like an archaeologist entering a tomb, like someone stumbling onto something that had been waiting patiently in the dark for the right moment, the right person. His hands trembled as he reached for the edge of the tarp. The fabric was heavy, industrial grade, the kind designed to protect valuable things from moisture and time. He pulled it back. For a moment, his mind couldn't process what he was seeing. Paintings, dozens of them, maybe 50 or more, each one framed in ornate wood or simple gilt, each one carefully wrapped in protective cloth that had yellowed with age but still served its purpose. The top painting was partially visible where the wrapping had loosened over the decades. It depicted a harbor scene, boats with tall masts, water rendered in shades of blue and grey that seemed to move even in the harsh beam of his flashlight. The style was old, classical, the kind of thing Harold had seen in museums on the rare occasions they'd visited. The paint was cracked with age in that distinctive pattern. Old oil paintings develop, tiny fissures across the surface, like a map of time itself. In the bottom corner, barely visible, was a signature. Harold leaned closer, trying to make out the name. The handwriting was elaborate, old-fashioned. He couldn't read it clearly in the dim light, but it looked important, official, the kind of signature that declared authorship with confidence. "Martha," he called, his voice strange even to his own ears, hollow and echoing in the small space. "You need to see this, right now." He heard her moving, heard her squeeze through the opening with a grunt of effort, heard her sharp intake of breath as she emerged into the hidden room, and her own flashlight joined his, doubling the illumination. "Harold," she whispered, and in that single word he heard everything he was feeling: disbelief, confusion, wonder, fear. "What is this?" "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I think we just found something impossible." When for one, they stood together in silence for a long moment, flashlight beams crossing and recrossing like searchlights, revealing more with each pass. The paintings weren't the only thing in the room. Against another wall stood wooden crates, carefully constructed, sealed with nails that had rusted but held firm. There was a desk in the corner, solid oak, covered in a layer of dust so thick it looked like velvet, and on that desk, notebooks, dozens of them, bound in leather, stacked neatly as if someone had just stepped away for a moment and intended to return. Martha moved to the nearest painting, her librarian's instincts taking over, the need to catalogue and understand overriding her shock. She carefully unwrapped the protective cloth, revealing the full canvas. It was perhaps 2 feet by 3 feet. The harbor scene Harold had glimpsed. Up close, the detail was extraordinary. You could see individual ripples in the water, individual threads in the sails, individual stones in the buildings along the waterfront. This wasn't amateur work. This was mastery. "Look at the frame," Martha said, running her fingers along the carved wood. "This is hand-carved, probably walnut, probably worth hundreds of dollars just by itself." They unwrapped another painting. This one showed a woman in Victorian-era clothing, sitting in a garden, reading a book. The light filtering through trees behind her seemed real enough to warm your skin. The signature in the corner was different but equally elaborate. Then another. A landscape of rolling hills and a small cottage, storm clouds gathering overhead. So realistic Harold could almost hear thunder. Then another. An abstract piece, all geometric shapes and bold colors, completely different in style from the others, but equally compelling. They worked in silence, carefully unwrapping painting after painting, each one a revelation, each one clearly valuable, though neither of them knew enough about art to estimate how valuable. Some were clearly very old, the wood frames dark with age, the canvas backing browned and brittle. Others seemed more recent, though still decades old, by the look of them. Every single one bore a signature. Some names Harold vaguely recognized from somewhere. Most he didn't. "This can't be real," Martha said finally, her voice shaking. "This has to be, I don't know, reproductions? Copies? People don't just hide valuable paintings in concrete bunkers, don't they?" Harold moved to one of the sealed crates, examining it carefully. Someone went to a lot of trouble here. This room wasn't built by accident. These paintings weren't hidden on a whim. He pulled out his pocket knife, working the blade under the edge of the crate's lid, prying gently. The old nails protested but gave way with a screech of metal on wood. Inside, packed in shredded paper that had compressed into a solid mass, were smaller items, sketches on heavy paper, watercolors in simple frames, what looked like preliminary studies for larger works. Each one carefully preserved, each one protected from moisture and light. At the bottom of the crate, wrapped in oilcloth, were notebooks. Harold lifted one out carefully. The leather binding cracked as he opened it, the pages yellowed but intact. The handwriting inside was meticulous, organized. The work of someone who valued record-keeping. He read aloud, his voice wavering. Item 7. Seascape with fishing vessels. Oil on canvas. 28 by 40 inches. Attributed to Circle of Joseph Mallord, William Turner. Circa 1835. Acquired May 19, 57. From estate sale, Philadelphia. Purchase price, $2,500. Estimated current value, unknown, possibly significant, if attribution confirmed. Martha looked up sharply. "That's a lot of money for 1957. Keep listening." Harold flipped through several pages, each entry following the same format. Artist name or attribution, date of creation, date of acquisition, purchase price. Notes on provenance. The amounts varied wildly. Some paintings had been purchased for a few $100s, others for tens of thousands. Enormous sums for the 1950s and early 60s. The last entry was dated March 15, 1962, just 3 months after the shelter was officially registered with the county as completed. "This was all hidden here the same year the shelter was built," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone used the shelter construction as cover, built this room inside it specifically to hide all of this. But why?" Harold set down the notebook, his mind racing. If you own valuable paintings, you display them, insure them, protect them in a normal way. You don't seal them in a concrete tomb in the middle of nowhere. The answer came from Martha, who'd moved to another crate and was carefully sifting through its contents. "Harold, look at this." She held up a stack of newspapers, yellowed and brittle, held together with a rubber band that disintegrated at her touch. The papers scattered slightly, and Harold caught one, examining the date. August 9, 1958. The headline made his breath catch. "Philadelphia art collector investigated in theft of priceless works." He read quickly, scanning the article. A collector named Theodore Ashford had amassed an impressive collection of American and European art over the previous decade. But questions had arisen about the provenance of some pieces. Insurance investigators suspected several paintings in his collection were actually works, reported stolen from museums and private collections across the eastern seaboard. A federal investigation had been launched. Another newspaper, dated October 1958. Ashford collection disappears. Millionaire collector vanishes. Amid theft investigation. And another, from January 1959. Federal investigation stalls. No trace of missing Ashford or his alleged stolen art collection. The last article was from June 1962, just months after the shelter was completed. Theodore Ashford, declared legally dead. Family claims, no knowledge of missing collection. Martha pulled out more documents from the crate. A property deed showing that Theodore Ashford had purchased the land where the rain shelter now stood in December 1961, paying cash $15,000 for 12 acres of nothing in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania. Another document showed he'd filed for a building permit in January 1962, claiming he wanted to build a civil defense shelter as a public service, offering to donate it to the county upon completion, in exchange for a modest tax break. He built this place, Harold said, the pieces falling into place with the inevitability of a puzzle that only had one solution. He didn't contract it out. He built it himself, working alone, according to these permits. He refused all county inspections until it was complete, then donated it to them sealed up and locked. And everyone thought he was just an eccentric millionaire doing his patriotic duty during the Cold War. He hid his entire collection here. Martha continued the thought. Paintings that were either already stolen or that he knew would be investigated. He built a vault disguised as a civil defense shelter, sealed everything inside, then walked away. Or died, Harold added quietly. The newspapers say he was declared dead in '62. No body found, just declared dead after enough time passed. They stood in the darkness of that hidden room, surrounded by $230 million worth of stolen art, though they didn't know the exact figure yet, and tried to comprehend what they'd stumbled into. This wasn't treasure. This was evidence. This was the answer to a 61-year-old mystery that had been sleeping beneath their feet the entire time they'd lived here. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Harold looked at Martha, at the woman he'd loved for 49 years, who'd stood beside him through every triumph and disaster, whose face in the harsh flashlight beam showed the same mix of emotions he felt: excitement, fear, confusion, and something else. Hope, maybe, though neither of them wanted to acknowledge it yet. "What do we do?" Martha asked, her voice steady despite everything. The question hung in the dusty air between them. They were standing in a room that officially didn't exist, surrounded by art that had been missing for 6 decades, art that someone had stolen and someone else had once owned legitimately. They were holding evidence of crimes committed before either of them had gray hair, crimes whose perpetrator was long dead, crimes whose victims might all be dead too, and they were broke, living in poverty so deep that $3 for a flashlight had been a significant purchase. sitting on a fortune that might not legally be theirs but that had been buried beneath them for 7 years of sleeping on concrete and eating day-old bread and enduring the pitying stares of an entire town. Harold knew what the right answer was. He'd always known right from wrong, had built his entire life on honesty and integrity and treating people fairly. But standing in that room, looking at Martha's thin face in the flashlight glow, seeing the patches on her dress and knowing she'd gone without medication last month because they couldn't afford both her pills and propane for heat, he felt temptation like a physical weight. They could take one painting, just one, something small that wouldn't be missed, sell it quietly to a private collector, no questions asked. Use the money to get a real place to live, to stop being objects of pity, to live their final years with some dignity. "We call the police," Harold said, and in saying it out loud, he made it real, made it the only option. "This isn't ours. These paintings were stolen. Someone owns them, or their estates own them, or insurance companies own them. We can't just keep them." Martha nodded slowly, but he saw her eyes linger on the paintings, saw her doing the same mental calculations he'd just done. One painting, just one. Who would know? Who would even care after 60 years? "You're right," she said finally, and he heard the war she'd fought in those 2 simple words, heard the temptation and the rejection of it, heard her choosing integrity over survival. "Of course you're right. We do this the right way." They climbed back through the opening, leaving the hidden room and its impossible contents behind the broken wall. Harold washed his face and hands in their small sink, the cold water shocking against his skin. Martha sat on their makeshift couch, hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing, processing everything. Finally, Harold picked up their ancient cell phone, a pay-as-you-go flip phone they kept for emergencies and rarely used because minutes cost money. He dialed 911. "Emergency services." "What's your emergency?" "Yes, hello. My name is Harold Brennan. My wife and I live at the old rain shelter off Miller Road, and we've just discovered something that I think the police need to see." There was a pause. "What kind of something, sir?" Harold looked at Martha, at the broken wall with concrete dust still settling, at the life they'd built from nothing in this forgotten place. He took a breath. "I think we've found the Ashford collection." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "Sir, did you say the Ashford collection?" "Yes, ma'am. Paintings. Dozens of them, maybe more, hidden in a sealed room we just broke into. I don't know if we're right, but there are newspapers in there from the 50s talking about Theodore Ashford and stolen art, and I think someone should probably come take a look. Stay where you are, Mr. Brennan. Officers are on their way." Harold hung up and sat beside Martha. They held hands in the gathering darkness, listening to the wind outside, waiting for their lives to change one more time. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. They'd made their choice. The only choice that let them sleep at night. The only choice that kept them who they were. 20 minutes later, they heard the sirens. The first to arrive was Deputy Raymond Miller, a young man in his late 20s who'd given the Brennans a ride into town once when their truck had broken down. He'd been kind then, treating them like people rather than problems, asking about Harold's carpentry work with genuine interest. He emerged from his patrol car with a flashlight and a skeptical expression that shifted to confusion when he saw the massive hole in the back wall and the clouds of concrete dust still hanging in the air like fog. "Mr. Brennan, Mrs. Brennan," he said, nodding to each of them with respectful formality. The dispatcher said something about the Ashford collection. That's a pretty specific claim to make. I know how it sounds, Harold replied, his voice tired but steady. But I think you should look for yourself, Deputy. Raymond approached the opening, shining his flashlight through into the darkness beyond. The beam found one of the partially unwrapped paintings leaning against the far wall, and even from where they stood, they could see his posture change, shoulders tensing with sudden alertness, his casual skepticism evaporating. Holy! He cut himself off. Professionalism overriding shock. I'm going to need to call this in. Don't touch anything else. And don't leave, please. More vehicles arrived over the next hour. First, Sheriff Thomas Dawson, a barrel-chested man in his 50s, who'd been sheriff for 23 years, and had seen just about everything Millbrook County could throw at him. Or so he'd thought until tonight. He emerged from his cruiser with the confident stride of someone used to being in charge. But that confidence faltered when Raymond showed him the hidden room. Then came 2 state police vehicles, their officers younger, more formal, immediately establishing a perimeter and treating the rain shelter like a crime scene. They photographed the opening Harold had made, the debris on the floor, the hidden room visible through the hole. They asked questions, taking statements from both Harold and Martha about when they'd moved in, when they'd discovered the seam, exactly what they'd found, and in what order. Through it all, the Brennans sat on their makeshift couch, wrapped in a donated blanket because someone had left the door open, and November air was pouring in, watching their shelter fill with strangers who looked at them with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and something that might have been respect. Around midnight, an unmarked sedan pulled up. A man in an expensive suit emerged, moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone important, someone who didn't waste time on small talk or pleasantries. He identified himself as Special Agent James Morrison from the FBI's art crime team, a division Harold hadn't known existed until that moment. Morrison spent 2 hours in the hidden room, emerging only to request additional lighting and photography equipment. When he finally came out, his expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes carried an excitement he couldn't quite suppress. He approached Harold and Martha where they still sat, now surrounded by evidence markers and police tape, their humble home transformed into an official investigation site. Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, Morrison said, pulling up one of their folding chairs and sitting across from them, like they were in a business meeting rather than a crime scene. I need to ask you both very clearly. Before tonight, did either of you have any knowledge of what was in that room? No, sir, Harold said firmly. We didn't even know the room existed until this morning when I noticed a seam in the wall. And you've lived here how long? 7 years. 7 years. This past September, Morrison nodded slowly, processing this information, calculating implications Harold could only guess at. And your first action upon discovering the collection was to call 911. Yes, sir. We broke through the wall around noon. We spent maybe 2 hours looking at what was there, trying to understand it. Then we called for help. Why? The question hung in the air. Harold and Martha exchanged glances. Because it wasn't ours, Martha said simply. Those paintings were hidden by someone, probably stolen from someone else. We're not thieves, Agent Morrison. We're just trying to live honestly. Morrison studied them both for a long moment, and Harold got the sense he was being evaluated in ways that went beyond his words, that this FBI agent was making assessments about character, about credibility, about whether 2 elderly people living in a rain shelter had the integrity they were claiming. I've spent the last 2 hours, Morrison said finally, comparing what's in that room to our database of stolen and missing art. If the attributions in those notebooks are accurate, and preliminary examination suggests they are, you've found one of the most significant stolen art collections in American history. Pieces that have been missing for over 60 years. Work by American masters, European painters, rare prints, drawings, even some sculptures in those sealed crates. He paused, letting that sink in. The preliminary estimate, and this is very preliminary, is somewhere between $200 and $250 million. Martha made a small sound, something between a laugh and a sob. Harold just stared, his mind unable to process numbers that large, unable to connect those numbers to the dusty paintings in the room behind him, unable to reconcile $250 million with the fact that they'd eaten peanut butter sandwiches for dinner. What happens now? Harold asked, when he could finally speak. Now, we secure the scene. We'll need to remove everything for authentication and cataloging. That process will take months, possibly years. There will be legal proceedings to determine rightful ownership. The original owners, or their estates, will have claims. The insurance companies that paid out on the thefts will have claims. He paused, choosing his words carefully. And you too, you may have a claim as well. We're not looking for a reward, Martha said quickly. We just thought someone should know. Morrison studied them again. These elderly people in their worn clothes, living in a concrete box, who'd found a fortune and immediately called the police. His expression softened slightly. Mrs. Brennan, you may not be looking for it, but you may have earned it nonetheless. The law does provide for compensation in cases like this, for what's called a finder's claim. But that's for lawyers and judges to sort out. For tonight, I need to ask you not to speak with anyone about this discovery. No media, no neighbors, no one. Can you do that? They nodded. Good. We'll have officers here around the clock until everything is removed and secured. That should be complete within 48 hours. As dawn broke over Millbrook, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, the Brennans sat outside their shelter on a bench Harold had built from salvaged wood. They watched as investigators in white gloves carefully carried painting after painting through the hole Harold had made. Each one documented, photographed, loaded into climate-controlled vans that had arrived sometime after 3 in the morning. The process would continue for 2 more days. Sheriff Dawson brought them coffee from Annie's diner in town. Hot and sweet. With real cream, it was the best thing Harold had tasted in months. Hell of a thing, Dawson said, shaking his head. Living on top of a fortune all this time, and never knowing. We were living on concrete, Harold corrected gently. The fortune was someone else's. The sheriff looked at him with newfound respect, really seeing him for perhaps the first time. That's a rare kind of honesty, Mr. Brennan. This town could use more of it. As the sun climbed higher and investigators continued their work, Harold and Martha finally retreated inside what remained of their shelter. The back wall now had a gaping hole, cold air pouring through despite the plastic sheeting someone had taped up. Dust covered everything. Their modest possessions looked even more humble surrounded by evidence markers and official forms. But they were together. They were safe. And they'd done the right thing. Martha put water on the hot plate for tea, their morning ritual unchanged by the night's revelations. Harold swept up concrete dust with methodical care, the same way he'd swept that morning before discovering the seam, before breaking through the wall, before everything changed. In town, word was already beginning to spread despite Morrison's warning. Deputy Miller had told his wife in strictest confidence. She'd told her sister, swearing her to secrecy. The sister had mentioned something to a friend at the grocery store. Just a hint, just enough. By noon, rumors were flying through Millbrook like wildfire. The Brennans had found treasure, had found gold, had found something worth millions. The details were vague, exaggerated, confused. But the core truth was making its way through town faster than any official statement could have stopped it. And with the rumors came something Harold and Martha had almost forgotten. Attention. Not the pitying kind or the mocking kind, but genuine, electric curiosity. The couple who lived in the rain shelter, who everyone had dismissed as too proud or too stubborn or too broken to accept help, had stumbled onto something extraordinary. For 7 years, they'd been invisible. Objects of pity at best, objects of scorn at worst. Now, suddenly, everyone wanted to see them. By the third day, the media had arrived in force. News vans from Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, even one from New York City, parked along Miller Road like a caravan of metal locusts hungry for stories. Reporters with perfect hair and expensive cameras stood in the cold November wind, recording segments in front of the rain shelter, while Harold and Martha hid inside, curtains drawn over the plywood windows, feeling like prisoners in their own home. The discovery of the legendary Ashford collection, valued at approximately $230 million, has shocked the art world and raised profound questions about ownership, rightful claims, and the remarkable story of the elderly couple who found it. One reporter intoned, her voice carrying through the thin walls with crystalline clarity. Inside, Harold sat at their small table, head in his hands, shoulders hunched under the weight of attention they'd never wanted. Martha made tea with shaking fingers, the hot plate struggling against the cold air still pouring through the plastic-covered hole in their back wall. The hole that had started everything. "They make it sound like we went looking for it," Harold said quietly, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "Like we're treasure hunters who knew what we'd find. Like this was some kind of scheme. People believe what makes the best story," Martha replied, setting a chipped mug in front of him, her own hands trembling slightly. "The truth is always quieter. It always is." The phone, their basic flip phone that usually went weeks without ringing, had become a source of constant harassment. It rang every 10 minutes, sometimes every 5. Reporters wanting exclusive interviews, lawyers offering their services, people claiming to represent the Ashford estate, though FBI investigation would later reveal Theodore Ashford had died without any living relatives. A producer from a documentary company wanted to option their life rights, whatever that meant. A reality TV show wanted to follow their story. A book agent saw tremendous commercial potential in their narrative. Harold had turned the phone off after the 23rd call, unable to bear another voice asking them to commodify their lives, to turn their poverty and their honesty into entertainment for people who'd never had to choose between medication and heat. Sheriff Dawson had posted Deputy Miller at the entrance to the property to keep the press at bay, creating a barrier between the Brennans and the circus that had descended on their quiet corner of nowhere. But the attention was suffocating anyway. They couldn't leave without being photographed, questioned, pursued like celebrities, instead of two elderly people who just wanted to be left alone. The grocery run Martha desperately needed to make sat postponed, their meager supplies dwindling to crackers and canned soup. They were running low on propane for the space heater. Harold's arthritis medication was down to 3 pills. But going into town meant running a gauntlet of cameras and questions, meant becoming public property, meant surrendering the last shreds of their privacy. Worse than the media, though, were the visitors from Millbrook. itself. People who'd crossed the street to avoid the Brennans for 7 years now showed up with casseroles and questions and sudden, convenient memories of friendship. Susan Pritchard arrived on the 4th day, the same woman who'd cornered Martha in the church parking lot and suggested they were embarrassing the community. She came bearing a basket of fresh-baked muffins, blueberry and banana nut, still warm from the oven. Her smile was bright, her voice syrupy with concern. "Martha, Harold, I've been so worried about you both with all this chaos. I brought you some breakfast." She stood in the doorway, unable to hide her fascination with the plastic-covered hole in the wall, her eyes darting around their humble space like she was cataloguing poverty for future gossip. "I always knew there was something special about you two. The way you carried yourselves with such dignity, living out here all alone. So brave, so inspiring." Martha accepted the muffins with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you, Susan. That's very kind. I was just telling Pastor Mitchell that the church should do something for you. A fundraiser, perhaps, or a special collection. After all you've been through, you deserve our support. Better late than never, right?" She laughed, a tinkling sound that grated on Harold's nerves like nails on concrete. "We're managing," Martha said, the same words she'd used for 7 years when Susan had driven past them, like they were invisible. "Well, if you need anything at all, you just let me know. We're practically family, after all. I was telling someone just yesterday that you and I have always been such close friends." After Susan left, Harold shook his head slowly, anger simmering beneath his exhaustion. 7 years, Martha. 7 years we've been here, and that woman has driven past us like we were ghosts. She suggested we were embarrassing the town by living here. Now we're practically family? "People are complicated," Martha offered, but there was steel in her voice, an edge that hadn't been there before. "Or maybe they're exactly as simple as they seem. Maybe they just value you based on what you can give them." The parade continued. Tom Ferguson from the grocery store, who'd watched Martha count pennies for day-old bread without offering help, now appeared with a box of groceries and a sudden interest in their well-being. "Just wanted to make sure you folks are eating well during all this stress. No charge, of course. You've always been valued customers." Harold accepted the box but couldn't quite meet Ferguson's eyes. He remembered every time he'd watched Martha put back items because they couldn't afford them. Remembered Ferguson looking away, pretending not to notice their poverty. Valued customers. The words felt hollow. Rick Porter, the construction foreman who'd lent Harold the sledgehammer, came by too, but his visit felt different. He brought the hammer back, cleaned and oiled, and refused Harold's thanks. "Keep it," Rick said simply. "Consider it an investment. You needed it when nobody else was helping. That matters." That felt real. The rest felt like performance, like people repositioning themselves now that the Brennans might matter, might have value, might be worth knowing. The worst visitor came on the 5th day. A man in his early 50s, well-dressed in a wool coat and leather gloves, driving a BMW that looked obscene parked next to their rusted truck. He knocked with the confident rhythm of someone used to doors opening for him. Harold answered. "Suspicious already. Can I help you, Mr. Brennan?" "My name is Marcus Ashford. Theodore Ashford was my great-uncle." Harold's hand tightened on the door. The FBI had said Ashford had no living relatives. Agent Morrison told us there were no heirs. Not direct heirs, no. But I'm family nonetheless, and I have documentation proving my connection. I'd like to discuss the collection you found. May I come in? "No," Harold said flatly. If you have a claim, file it through proper legal channels. We're not discussing this on our doorstep." Marcus's friendly expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Brennan, let's be reasonable. That collection belonged to my family. You've been living here, squatting really, on property you don't own. The decent thing would be to recognize that you have no legitimate claim to art that was clearly intended to stay in the Ashford family. The decent thing." Martha appeared beside Harold, her voice cold as the November air, "would be to go through legal channels instead of showing up uninvited to intimidate people. The FBI said your great-uncle had no heirs. If you're disputing that, take it up with them." Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Just trying to resolve this amicably before lawyers get involved. But if that's how you want to play it, fine. Just remember, Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, you're way out of your depth here. This isn't about some small-town property dispute. This is about hundreds of millions of dollars and people with resources you can't imagine. Be smart about this." He turned and walked back to his BMW, leaving the threat hanging in the cold air like smoke. Harold closed the door, his hands shaking with anger rather than fear. "He's trying to scare us. It's working a little," Martha admitted. That night, someone threw a brick through their plywood window. No note, no message, just a brick wrapped in newspaper crashing through at 2 in the morning, sending both of them bolt upright in their makeshift bed, hearts pounding. Deputy Miller arrived within 10 minutes, but there were no witnesses, no evidence, just the brick and the message it sent. Someone wanted them afraid. The attorney arrived on day 7. Her name was Claire Donovan, and unlike the reporters and well-wishers and intimidators, she came with no cameras, no audience, just a briefcase and a straightforward manner that reminded Harold of his daughter, Rebecca, direct, competent, unimpressed by nonsense. "Mr. and Mrs. Brennan," she said, sitting at their cleared table after Harold had swept away concrete dust to make space. "I represent a consortium of legal experts who specialize in treasure trove law, adverse possession, and property rights. I've been following your case closely, and I'd like to offer my services pro bono." "Why?" Harold asked bluntly, too tired for politeness. "What's in it for you? Everyone wants something." Claire smiled, appreciating his directness. "The truth? If we win, the legal precedent will be valuable. Cases like yours are rare, and the outcome could influence how similar situations are handled for decades. That's worth something to me professionally. But also," she paused, choosing her words with visible care, "I believe in what you did. You found something extraordinary and immediately reported it. Most people wouldn't have. Most people would have stayed quiet, sold pieces gradually, disappeared with the money. That kind of integrity deserves to be defended, not punished." "What are our chances?" Martha asked, her librarian's practicality cutting through emotion. "Honestly, it's complicated, and it won't be easy. The art was stolen 60-plus years ago from various collectors and museums. Most of the original owners are deceased, but their estates may have claims. The insurance companies that paid out on the thefts will argue they're now the rightful owners, since they compensated the original losses. The federal government may try to claim the property as proceeds of criminal activity, and you two, as the finders occupying the property where it was discovered, have what's called a finder's claim under common law." "But we were living here," Harold interjected. "This was our home, such as it is. Doesn't that matter?" "It absolutely matters. There's a legal concept called adverse possession. Essentially, you've been occupying this property, maintaining it, living in it openly for 7 years. The county abandoned it, condemned it, forgot about it. You turned it into a habitable dwelling. That could strengthen your position significantly. Over the next 2 hours, Claire laid out the legal landscape with the kind of clarity that made Harold understand why she'd succeeded in her profession. It was complex, contested, and would likely take years to fully resolve. Multiple parties had already filed preliminary claims. The art itself had been seized by the FBI and was being authenticated piece by piece in climate-controlled facilities. Expert after expert was being consulted to verify attributions, confirm provenance, establish current market values. "Here's what I can tell you," Claire said finally, pulling out a yellow legal pad covered in notes. In most finders' cases involving stolen property, the finder receives between 10 and 40% of the recovered value as compensation for their honesty and for facilitating the return of the property. Given your circumstances, your length of residence, your immediate reporting, the abandonment of the property by the county, your maintenance of it as a dwelling, I believe we could argue for the higher end of that range. Possibly more, if we can establish that the county's abandonment effectively transferred ownership to you through adverse possession. Harold and Martha exchanged glances. Even 10% of $230 million was $23 million, a number so large it felt fictional, impossible to connect to their concrete reality. "What do we need to do?" Martha asked. "First, don't talk to anyone without my presence. The media will try to get you to say things that could be used against you in court. Second, we document everything: how long you've lived here, what you've paid in terms of maintenance and utilities, how you discovered the room, your decision-making process in calling authorities. Third," she looked around the shelter with barely concealed dismay at the plastic-covered hole, the concrete walls, the makeshift furniture. "We need to address your living situation. I know this is your home, but the optics of you staying here during legal proceedings are complicated." "We're not leaving," Harold said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of 7 years of stubbornness. 7 years of refusing to be pushed out of spaces people decided they didn't belong. "This is all we have. If we leave, we have nowhere to go. Our children's offers came with strings we're not willing to accept." "I understand." "But, no," Martha interrupted, her voice gentle but absolutely immovable. "You need to understand. We've been pushed out of one home already. We've been pitied, mocked, and dismissed for living here. This place might not be much, but it's ours, or as close to ours as anything has been in 7 years. We won't be forced out again by lawyers or reporters or people throwing bricks through our windows." Claire studied them both for a long moment, her expression shifting from concern to something like admiration. "All right, then we make that part of our argument. You've been maintaining abandoned county property, making it habitable, exercising your right to occupy it. You've improved it, defended it, lived in it openly. That actually strengthens our case for adverse possession considerably." She stayed for another hour, taking detailed notes, asking questions, building their defense. When she finally prepared to leave, she paused at the door, her hand on the frame. "One more thing. The judge assigned to this case is Sandra Meyer. She's tough, brilliant, and she doesn't suffer fools. She's also known for having strong opinions about corporate overreach and people being taken advantage of by systems designed to protect the powerful. Your immediate honesty in reporting this find, that will matter to her. Your living situation, your age, the fact that you maintained this property when the county abandoned it, All of that plays into her sense of equity and fairness. After Claire left, Harold and Martha sat in their familiar silence, processing everything. The legal battle ahead would be long, expensive, and public. They'd be examined, questioned, their lives dissected in court documents and news articles. Their poverty would become part of the public record. Their choices would be judged by people who'd never had to make them. "Are you sure about this?" Martha asked finally. "We could walk away. Just let them fight over it and go back to being invisible." "No," Harold said quietly. "We can't. Not anymore. For 7 years we've accepted being invisible, being dismissed, being pitied. We did the right thing finding that collection. And now we have to fight for the right thing to matter. Not just for us, but because if honest people don't get rewarded, then only dishonest people will benefit from situations like this." Martha reached for his hand, her fingers thin and cold but strong. "Then we fight." The research began that night. Claire had left them with copies of newspaper articles about Theodore Ashford, about the collection, about the investigation that had ultimately gone nowhere. Harold read them aloud while Martha made notes on a pad of paper they'd gotten from the dollar store. Theodore Ashford had been born in 1914 in Philadelphia, to a wealthy manufacturing family. He'd inherited the family fortune in 1948 after his father's death, had immediately sold the business, and had devoted himself to collecting art. By all accounts, he'd been obsessive, knowledgeable, and willing to pay top dollar for pieces that interested him. The trouble started in 1956 when an insurance investigator noticed similarities between a painting in Ashford's collection and a work reported stolen from a Boston museum 3 years earlier. Further investigation revealed several other suspicious pieces. Some had questionable provenance. Others matched descriptions of works that had gone missing from private collections across the eastern seaboard. Ashford had denied everything, claimed his acquisitions were all legitimate, produced bills of sale that seemed authentic but couldn't be fully verified. The federal investigation had been thorough but ultimately inconclusive. No one could prove the paintings were stolen beyond reasonable doubt. No one could prove they weren't. Then, in October 1958, Theodore Ashford had simply vanished. His Philadelphia mansion was found empty, his collection gone. No note, no explanation. Initially treated as a missing person case, it eventually shifted to a presumption of death when no trace of him could be found. His body never turned up. His fortune, apart from the missing collection, had been in trusts that eventually passed to distant relatives. "He knew they were closing in," Martha said, reading one of the articles. "He couldn't prove the pieces were legitimate, so he hid them, built this shelter, sealed them inside, probably planned to wait until the investigation died down and then retrieve them. But he died first," Harold continued the thought, "or disappeared so completely it amounted to the same thing. And the collection sat here for 61 years, sealed in concrete, forgotten." What they discovered next changed everything. Deep in the stack of papers Claire had left was a property survey from 1961, showing the exact boundaries of the land Ashford had purchased. Harold spread it on their table, comparing it to a current county map he'd requested from Frank, his cousin, in the assessor's office. The boundaries hadn't changed. The rain shelter sat on the exact parcel Ashford had purchased. But when the county had condemned the shelter in 1998, they'd done so without checking ownership. They'd assumed, as everyone had, that the shelter was county property, part of the original civil defense program. "It wasn't," Harold said slowly, his finger tracing the property lines. The county never actually owned this land. Ashford donated the shelter itself, but retained ownership of the property. When he died without heirs, it should have gone through probate, but somehow it got lost in the bureaucratic shuffle. For 61 years, this land has been legally ownerless, in a kind of administrative limbo. Which means, Martha continued, her librarian's mind connecting the dots, when we moved in and started living here, we weren't squatting on county property. We were occupying abandoned private property that had no legal owner. They stared at each other as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about a finder's claim. This was about ownership itself. If the property had no legal owner, and they'd occupied it openly for 7 years, improving it, maintaining it, treating it as their home, they might actually own it. And if they owned the property, their claim to everything in it became exponentially stronger. Claire Donovan nearly dropped her briefcase when they called her the next morning with this information. She arrived within 2 hours, bringing a real estate attorney from her firm who specialized in property law. They spent the entire day tracing the property's legal history, confirming what Harold had discovered. "This changes everything," Claire said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "The county condemned a building on property they didn't own. They have no legal standing here at all. And if Ashford died interstate without heirs, and the property sat in legal limbo for 6 decades, your adverse possession claim becomes primary. You've been living here for 7 years, maintaining it, improving it, occupying it openly. That's enough time under Pennsylvania law to establish adverse possession if no one contests it. But people are contesting it now," Harold pointed out. "That Marcus Ashford, the insurance companies, all of them. Let them try. They'll have to prove legal ownership of the property first, and they can't. The land belongs to whoever's been treating it as their own, and that's you two." Word of this development leaked, as everything eventually did in the age of court documents and public records. The media narrative shifted. Elderly couple may actually own priceless collection they discovered. The pressure intensified. The threats intensified too. More bricks through windows. A dead cat left on their doorstep with a note, "Back off, or you're next." Phone calls from blocked numbers with whispered warnings. Harold started sleeping with a baseball bat beside the bed. Martha jumped at every sound. But something else was happening too. The community of Millbrook, which had been quick to judge and slow to help, began to fracture. Some people, like Susan Pritchard, continued their performative friendship, seeing opportunity in association with the Brennans. But others began to see something different. Pastor Mitchell gave a sermon about the Good Samaritan, about how those who'd walked past suffering were confronted with their own failure when the suffering person turned out to be blessed. He didn't name the Brennans directly, but everyone knew. Some parishioners walked out, others stayed and wept. A group of younger people, millennials who'd moved to Millbrook for cheaper housing, started a petition supporting the Brennans' claim. They set up a Facebook page called Justice for Harold and Martha that went modestly viral, reaching 20,000 followers in a week. Deputy Miller started parking his patrol car at the shelter every night on his own time, a silent guard against whoever was making threats. When Sheriff Dawson told him to stop, that it wasn't official business, Miller quit the sheriff's department and kept showing up anyway. "Some things matter more than a paycheck," he said simply. Rick Porter, the construction foreman, organized a group of contractors to repair the damage from the brick-throwing incidents, replacing the plywood windows with real glass, fixing the hole in the wall properly, even installing insulation. "No charge," he said when Harold tried to pay. "Just letting you know some of us see what you did. Honesty matters." The library where Martha had once worked organized a book drive in her honor, collecting volumes to donate to a literacy program. The card included a note from Margaret Holmes, the former head librarian. "You taught our children that character matters more than circumstance. We should have remembered that ourselves. We're sorry it took so long." Slowly, painfully, Millbrook began to divide, not between those who supported the Brennans and those who didn't, but between those who recognized their own failure to see what had always been there, and those who still couldn't or wouldn't. On a cold December evening, 6 weeks after the discovery, Harold and Martha hosted a small gathering. Not a party exactly, but an acknowledgement of alliance. Claire Donovan was there, along with Raymond Miller, Rick Porter, Pastor Mitchell, Margaret Holmes, and Sheriff Dawson, who'd shown up uninvited but was welcomed anyway. They sat around the small space, eating pizza that Rick had brought, drinking coffee that Pastor Mitchell had supplied, talking not about the case or the money, but about life, about struggle, about what it means to hold on to dignity when everything else is stripped away. "You know what you two did," Margaret said at one point, her eyes wet behind her glasses. "You held up a mirror to this whole town, made us look at ourselves. Some of us didn't like what we saw. We just did what we thought was right." Martha said quietly. "That's the point," Raymond added. "You had every reason to be bitter, to take what you found and run, to say the world owed you. Instead, you called for help. That says something about who you are." Harold looked around the room at these people, some who'd been kind all along, others who'd come late to kindness but were here now, and felt something shift inside him. Not hope exactly, but something close. The sense that maybe, just maybe, doing the right thing might actually matter in the end. "Whatever happens with the court case," he said slowly, "we're grateful for all of you, for proving that not everyone forgets who they are when circumstances change." Outside, the December wind howled around their concrete shelter. Inside, surrounded by people who'd chosen to see them as humans rather than problems, Harold and Martha felt something they hadn't felt in 7 years. Belonging. The fight was far from over. The legal battles would rage for months more. The threats would continue. The media circus would intensify before it faded. But in that moment, eating pizza in a converted rain shelter with people who'd chosen alliance over indifference, the Brennans knew they wouldn't face it alone. And sometimes, that makes all the difference. The courthouse in downtown Millbrook was built in 1923, all limestone columns and marble floors that echoed with the footsteps of countless people seeking justice or avoiding it. Harold and Martha had never been inside before, had never needed lawyers or judges, had always kept their heads down and their problems private. Their entire philosophy of life had been to solve their own issues, accept their circumstances, and never ask for what they hadn't earned. Now, 14 months after breaking through that concrete wall, they sat in the gallery of Courtroom 3 wearing their best clothes. Harold in a suit Claire Donovan had insisted on buying for him, navy blue and properly fitted, making him look like the successful carpenter he'd once been. Martha in a simple dress, also purchased by Claire over Martha's protests, a soft gray that brought out the blue in her eyes and gave her a dignity that poverty had tried to strip away but never quite managed. Around them sat lawyers in expensive suits, representing 7 different parties. Insurance companies that had paid out claims in the 1950s. A man claiming to be a distant Ashford relative, though his documentation remained disputed. Representatives from 2 museums that had reported pieces stolen decades ago, the county, arguing they had some claim to property they'd once condemned. The federal government, taking the position that proceeds of theft belonged to no one. And Claire Donovan, representing 2 elderly people who'd simply done the right thing, Judge Sandra Meyer presided. A woman in her early 60s with steel-gray hair pulled into a neat bun and reading glasses perched on her nose. She'd spent the morning listening to arguments from all parties, each claiming ownership or right to compensation for the art collection that had been valued, after extensive authentication, at $237 million. Not an estimate anymore. A fact, established by the world's leading experts, who'd spent over a year examining every piece, confirming attributions, establishing provenance for works that had been missing for over 6 decades. Now, as afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, Judge Meyer called Harold and Martha to the stand. They walked forward together, Harold's hand on Martha's elbow, both of them moving with the careful dignity of people who knew they were being judged for more than just their legal claim. The bailiff swore them in. They sat, hands clasped together on the polished wood of the witness box. Judge Meyer looked at them over her glasses, her expression neutral but not unkind. Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, I've read your attorney's briefs extensively. I've reviewed property records, adverse possession law, treasure trove precedents, and finders' rights cases going back over a century. But I'd like to hear from you directly, in your own words, about your living situation and how you came to discover this collection. Harold cleared his throat, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. Your Honor, my wife and I lost our home 7 years ago. Medical bills from Martha's cancer treatment, business failures, bad decisions on my part. We found ourselves with nowhere to go and too much pride to burden our children, who had their own lives and their own struggles. The rain shelter was abandoned county property, or so we thought. We moved in, made it livable, paid for utilities when we could manage it. It wasn't much, but it was honest. And the discovery? Judge Meyer prompted. I was sweeping the floor, ma'am. My broom caught on a seam I'd never noticed in 7 years of living there. I'm a carpenter by trade, was a carpenter, and I knew that wall wasn't original construction, so I borrowed a sledgehammer and broke through, and we found what we found. And your immediate action was to call the police. Yes, ma'am. It didn't belong to us. We knew that right away. Judge Meyer turned to Martha. Mrs. Brennan, you've been very quiet throughout these proceedings. Do you have anything to add? Martha looked up, her voice soft but carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. Your Honor, people in this town have called us many things over the years. Stubborn, proud, foolish for not accepting help when it was offered. Maybe they're right about some of that, but we've never been thieves. We've never taken what wasn't ours. When we found those paintings, we knew someone had hidden them, probably stolen them originally. We're not lawyers or art experts, but we know right from wrong. So we called for help. That's all we did. The courtroom was completely silent. Not a cough, not a shuffled paper, not a whisper. Judge Meyer made a note on the pad in front of her, then looked back at them. Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, do you understand that several parties in this room are arguing that you have no legal claim to any portion of this find, that the art was stolen property and therefore cannot be claimed by anyone except the original owners or their estates? We understand, Your Honor, Harold said, and we accept that. We're not here demanding anything. We're just asking to be treated fairly. Fairly how? Harold paused, gathering his thoughts. We lived above that collection for 7 years. We maintained that property when everyone else abandoned it. We reported the find immediately when we could have stayed quiet. When we could have taken one painting and sold it, and no one would have known. If there's any compensation for finders, for honest people who do the right thing even when it's hard, we'd like to be considered. But if not, he reached for Martha's hand, we'll still know we did what was right. That has to be enough. Judge Meyer leaned back in her chair, studying them with an intensity that made Harold feel transparent, as though she could see every struggle, every hungry night, every moment of doubt they'd endured. Then she addressed the entire courtroom. This case presents several complex legal questions about property rights, adverse possession, finder's claims, and the treatment of recovered stolen property. I'm going to take a 30-minute recess to review my notes and the relevant precedents one final time. But I want everyone in this courtroom to understand something. She removed her glasses, her gaze sweeping across the assembled lawyers with their $1,000 suits and their billable hours. The law isn't just about who has the best claim on paper. It's about equity. It's about rewarding honesty and penalizing bad faith. The Brennans had every opportunity to conceal this find, to sell pieces quietly on the black market, to disappear with a fortune that could have solved every problem they've faced. They chose transparency instead. They chose integrity. That matters to this court, and it should matter to everyone here. She banged her gavel. 30-minute recess. Harold and Martha stood, moving back to their seats in the gallery beside Claire Donovan. The lawyer's hand trembled slightly as she squeezed Martha's shoulder. Around them, other lawyers huddled, whispering urgently, recalculating their strategies based on Judge Meyer's tone. They waited. Martha's fingers twisted in her lap, a nervous habit Harold recognized from 49 years of marriage. He covered her hands with his own, stilling them, offering silent comfort the way they'd comforted each other, through every crisis, every loss, every moment when giving up would have been easier than going on. When Judge Meyer returned, the courtroom fell silent so completely that Harold could hear his own heartbeat, could hear Martha's breathing beside him, could hear the clock on the wall ticking away seconds that felt like hours. After careful review, Judge Meyer began, her voice formal but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been satisfaction. I'm ready to issue my ruling. This is subject to appeal, and many of these issues will likely require further litigation at higher levels. But here are my findings based on current law and the specific facts of this case. She looked down at her notes, then up at the assembled parties. First, regarding the original owners of the stolen art. Through FBI investigation and extensive documentation review, we've confirmed that 11 pieces have living heirs with clear, documented title. Those 11 pieces will be returned to those families immediately. And this court congratulates them on recovering family treasures they thought were lost forever. The insurance companies that paid claims on those pieces may seek reimbursement through separate civil proceedings, but that's not before this court today. Murmurs ran through the courtroom. Claire Donovan made rapid notes. Second, regarding the property itself. The land on which the rain shelter stands was purchased by Theodore Ashford in 1961. Upon his death intestate and without heirs in 1964, that property should have gone through probate. It did not. Through bureaucratic error, it remained in legal limbo for over 60 years, unclaimed, and unowned. The county's condemnation of the structure in 1998 was legally meaningless, as they had no ownership stake in the property. She paused, letting that sink in. The Brennans occupied this abandoned property openly and continuously for 7 years, maintaining it, improving it, paying utilities, treating it as their primary residence. Under Pennsylvania's adverse possession statute, which requires 7 years of open, continuous, and exclusive possession of abandoned property, I find that Harold and Martha Brennan are the legal owners of the property and the structure upon it. Harold felt Martha's hand tighten on his. He couldn't breathe, couldn't process what he was hearing. Third, regarding the remaining artwork for which no clear heir or claimant can be established. These pieces were abandoned by Theodore Ashford, who died without heirs. They were concealed on property that has now been legally transferred to the Brennans through adverse possession. They were discovered by the Brennans through lawful means and immediately reported despite significant personal financial hardship. Judge Meyer's gaze settled on Harold and Martha. Under the doctrine of treasure trove, which applies to found property that has been deliberately hidden or concealed, and considering the unique circumstances of this case, the property ownership, the immediate reporting, the integrity demonstrated, I'm ruling that Harold and Martha Brennan have established a superior claim to all artwork, for which no clear heir can be established. The courtroom erupted. Lawyers stood, objecting, shuffling papers. Claire Donovan's hand flew to her mouth, but Judge Meyer wasn't finished. Specifically, she continued, her voice cutting through the noise, the Brennans are entitled to full ownership of 64 pieces for which no heir has been established, with a combined authenticated value of $97 million. The remaining pieces, with disputed but possible claims, will be held in trust, pending resolution of those claims. If those claims fail, those pieces will also revert to the Brennans. She looked directly at the insurance company lawyers, who were already preparing objections. My reasoning is straightforward. The Brennans occupied and owned the property where the art was found. They discovered it lawfully. They reported it immediately despite desperate poverty. They cooperated fully with authorities. They demonstrated integrity that is, frankly, rare in cases involving this much money. The law should reward such behavior, not punish it. Insurance companies that paid claims 60 years ago and have long since recouped those losses through premiums have a weaker claim than two people who chose honesty over fortune. She banged her gavel as the noise intensified. Your objections are noted for the record, and you may certainly appeal. But this is my ruling and it stands. This court is adjourned. Formal orders will be issued within 30 days. The gavel fell again. Final and absolute. For a moment, Harold and Martha just sat there, unable to move, unable to speak. $97 million. The words didn't make sense. Couldn't make sense. They'd been counting pennies for 7 years, choosing between medication and food, wearing clothes held together with patches and prayers. Claire Donovan appeared in front of them, her professional composure cracking, tears streaming down her face. You did it. You actually did it. Judge Meyer just set a precedent that will be cited for decades. What does it mean? Martha asked, her voice small and confused. We own the paintings? You own 64 paintings currently valued at $97 million. Yes. After taxes and legal fees, you're looking at approximately $72 million. And you own the property. That land, that shelter, it's legally yours now. The county has no claim. No one has a claim. It's yours. Harold stood slowly, his legs unsteady. He looked around the courtroom at the insurance lawyers gathering their papers in defeat, at the supposed Ashford heir whose face had gone pale with fury, at the reporters rushing for the doors to file their stories. Then he looked at Martha, at the woman who'd stood beside him through 49 years of marriage, through the loss of their daughter, through cancer and bankruptcy, and 7 years of living in a concrete box while the world looked away. "We should go home," he said quietly. The news hit Millbrook like a tidal wave. The elderly couple living in the rain shelter, the ones people had pitied and mocked and dismissed, had just been awarded nearly $100 million and legal ownership of the property they'd occupied. The story made national headlines within hours. Integrity rewarded. Elderly couples' honesty pays off in landmark ruling. And, from poverty to wealth, the most honest people in America finally get their due. But in Millbrook itself, the reaction was more complicated, more personal, more uncomfortable. The town had to confront what it had been, what it had done, who it had failed to see for 7 years. Susan Pritchard, who'd called them an embarrassment and then pretended to be their friend, stopped coming around entirely. She couldn't face them, couldn't reconcile her own cruelty with their grace. Others felt the same shame, that burning recognition of having failed a basic test of human decency. But some celebrated genuinely. Rick Porter organized a dinner at the VFW Hall. Nothing fancy, just pulled pork and coleslaw, and 300 people who wanted to acknowledge that something remarkable had happened. When Harold and Martha walked in, uncertain and overwhelmed, the room stood and applauded. Not for their money, though that was part of it, but for proving that integrity still mattered, that doing the right thing could still be rewarded. Pastor Mitchell gave a benediction. "We are gathered to celebrate not wealth, but character." Harold and Martha Brennan could have taken everything and run. Instead, they called for help. They trusted in a system that hasn't always been trustworthy. They chose honesty when dishonesty would have been so much easier. That is what we celebrate tonight. The money came through in installments over the next 6 months, structured carefully by financial advisors Claire had recommended. Harold and Martha moved slowly, deliberately, refusing to let sudden wealth change who they were at their core. They bought a house, but not a mansion. A modest 3-bedroom ranch on the edge of Millbrook. Nothing ostentatious, just solid and warm and properly insulated. It had a kitchen with a real stove, a bathroom with hot water that didn't sputter, and a workshop in the garage where Harold could finally set up his tools properly. The whole thing cost $420,000, a fraction of what they could afford, but it felt right. It felt like home. They furnished it simply. Martha chose a kitchen table large enough for family gatherings they hoped to have, now that they could invite their children without the shame of their poverty hanging over everything. Harold built bookshelves, his old skills returning, his hands remembering what it felt like to create, rather than just repair. They bought a new truck, a sensible Toyota, reliable and practical, and kept the old one too because it had carried them through the worst years and deserved better than a junkyard. They hired a young mechanic, struggling to start his own business, to restore it, paying him more than he asked, because they remembered what it was like to need the work. Then they started giving back, not with fanfare or publicity, but quietly, deliberately, the way people give when they truly understand need, rather than just sympathize with it. They established a fund through the church, managed by a committee that didn't include them, to help families facing foreclosure. Anonymous payments that made mortgages current, that gave people time to recover, that prevented what had happened to them from happening to others. The only requirement was that recipients had to have tried everything else first, had to have exhausted every option, because Harold and Martha understood that help meant more when you'd fought first. They donated to the county hospital to cover medical debt for low-income patients. Not in their own names, just anonymous payments that turned six-figure bills into zero balances, that let people breathe again, that kept medical crisis from becoming financial catastrophe. Martha worked with the billing department to identify people who'd been making $5 payments on $50,000 bills. People who would never catch up but kept trying anyway. Those were the ones they helped first. They set up scholarships at Millbrook High School, but not for the obvious candidates, not for the straight-A students who'd get scholarships anyway, for the kids who worked 2 jobs to help their families, who showed up exhausted but showed up anyway, who had character even when they didn't have opportunities. $5,000 a year for 4 years, enough to make college possible instead of just theoretical. They bought the rain shelter from the county for $1. The county was relieved to be rid of it and donated it to a local organization that helped homeless veterans. The structure was gutted and properly renovated, transformed into an emergency shelter with real heat, real beds, and real dignity. A plaque on the front read, "Everyone deserves a safe place to weather the storm," in honor of Harold and Martha Brennan, who never forgot what it means to have nothing. Word spread, as word always does in small towns, but this time the gossip was different. People began to understand that the Brennans weren't hoarding their fortune or leaving town or buying yachts and vacation homes. They were using it the way they'd always used everything. Carefully, thoughtfully, with consideration for others who were struggling the way they'd struggled. The shift in Millbrook was slow but real. People who'd looked away when the Brennans walked past now met their eyes, offered genuine smiles, spoke with respect that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with recognition of who they'd always been. The town began to see what it had missed, what it had failed to value, until a fortune forced them to look closer. Susan Pritchard eventually came to their new house, standing on the porch, with tears streaming down her face. "I need to apologize," she said, when Martha opened the door. "Not because you have money now, but because I should have apologized 7 years ago. I was cruel. I said terrible things. I treated you like you were embarrassing me when the truth is, I was embarrassed by my own lack of compassion. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know that I see it now. I see what I did." Martha looked at her for a long moment. She could have turned her away, could have pointed out every specific cruelty, every dismissive comment, every time Susan had made them feel less than human. But instead, she opened the door wider. "Come in, Susan." I made coffee. They talked for 2 hours. Not about money, but about fear, about how easy it is to look away from suffering, because acknowledging it means acknowledging our own vulnerability, our own potential to fall. Susan left with red eyes and a lighter heart, carrying forgiveness she hadn't earned, but was given anyway because that's what grace means. Harold and Martha reached out to their children, inviting them to visit, rebuilding relationships that had frayed under the weight of poverty and pride. Daniel came from Ohio with his wife and 2 teenagers. Rebecca drove up from Maryland with her 3 young children. There was awkwardness at first, years of distance and hurt feelings that money couldn't erase. But slowly, over dinners at that large kitchen table, over Harold teaching his grandchildren woodworking in his new workshop, over Martha reading stories to the little ones, the way she'd once read to students in the library, The family began to heal. "I should have helped more," Daniel said one evening after the kids were in bed. "I offered the retirement community, but I should have offered more than that. I should have just helped. No strings attached. We wouldn't have accepted," Harold said honestly. "We were too proud, too stubborn, maybe too stupid." "You weren't stupid," Rebecca interjected. "You were trying to maintain your dignity in a world that wanted to strip it away. I get that now. I didn't then, but I do now." They sat together in comfortable silence, and Harold realized that this family gathered around. Forgiveness flowing both ways. Love relearning how to express itself. This was worth more than any painting in any vault. 1 year after the court ruling, Harold and Martha did something that surprised everyone. They held a community meeting at the renovated shelter, inviting everyone in Millbrook to attend. 300 people showed up. Curiosity overcoming caution. Harold stood before them, Martha at his side, and spoke plainly. "Martha and I have been thinking about what happened to us, about what we learned, about what we want our lives to mean now that we've been given this extraordinary second chance. We didn't choose poverty. Nobody does. But we learned from it. We learned who we were when everything else was stripped away. We learned that integrity matters even when nobody's watching. Especially when nobody's watching." He paused, looking around at faces that had once looked away from his. "Some of you were kind to us when we had nothing. Rick Porter lent me tools. Margaret Holmes spoke to us like we were human beings. Pastor Mitchell never made us feel unwelcome at church even when others did. Deputy Miller, now Officer Miller since the sheriff hired him back, gave us rides and protection. We won't forget that kindness. It mattered more than you knew. But others of you looked away, crossed the street to avoid us, treated us like we were contagious, like poverty was something you could catch by acknowledging it. And we want you to know," his voice softened, "we forgive you, not because you've earned it, but because carrying anger and resentment is too heavy. And we've carried enough heavy things in our lives." Martha stepped forward then. "We also want to announce something. We're establishing the Millbrook Dignity Fund with an initial contribution of $10 million. It will provide emergency assistance to families in crisis, help with medical bills, prevent foreclosures, support small businesses struggling to survive. But more than that, it will treat people with respect. No means testing that strips away pride. No judgments about how you got into trouble, just help when help is needed, given the way we wished someone had helped us." The room erupted in applause, but Harold raised his hand. "We're not telling you this for gratitude. We're telling you because we want this town to learn what we learned, that anyone can fall, that circumstances don't define character, that the way we treat people when they're down says everything about who we are." After the meeting, people lined up not to thank them, though many did, but to share their own stories. A woman who'd lost her husband and was 3 months behind on her mortgage. A veteran struggling with PTSD who couldn't hold down a job. A young couple whose medical bills from a premature birth were drowning them. A man who'd lost his business and his confidence and didn't know how to rebuild either. Harold and Martha listened to every story, took every name, connected people with the fund's administrators. They couldn't fix everything, but they could help, and helping felt better than anything money had ever bought them. The rain shelter, renovated and repurposed, became something unexpected, a symbol. People made pilgrimages to see it, to stand in front of this concrete structure that had housed both desperate poverty and priceless treasure, that represented both the worst of circumstances and the best of human character. A small museum was eventually created in an adjacent building, telling the story not of the art collection, but of the two people who'd found it and immediately given it up. School groups visited. Business ethics classes studied the case. Books were written, analyzing the decision to call police rather than take the fortune. Harold and Martha declined most interview requests, uncomfortable with being held up as heroes, insisting they'd just done what anyone should do. But they agreed to one documentary, produced by a local filmmaker, because they wanted the message preserved. Integrity matters, character endures, and how you behave when no one's watching defines who you truly are. 3 years after the discovery, Harold and Martha celebrated their 52nd wedding anniversary. They held a party at their home, inviting everyone who'd been part of their journey. Claire Donovan, who'd become a dear friend, Officer Raymond Miller and his new wife, Rick Porter and the contractors who'd helped them, Pastor Mitchell, Margaret Holmes, their children and grandchildren, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by their story or their generosity. As sunset painted the Pennsylvania sky in shades of gold and crimson, Harold stood on his back porch, looking out over the small yard with its vegetable garden that Martha had planted, its workshop where he built furniture he gave away, its ordinary beauty that felt extraordinary after 7 years of concrete. Martha joined him, sliding her hand into his the way she'd done 10,000 times before. "Any regrets?" she asked. Harold thought about it. About the 7 years in the shelter, about the mockery and the pity, about the cold and the hunger and the constant weight of being dismissed, about the fortune they'd found and immediately reported, about the legal battle, the threats, the media circus, about the money they now had, and all the ways they were using it. "None," he said finally. "Not a single one. We stayed who we were, Martha. Through all of it, we stayed who we were. That matters more than any painting ever could." She leaned her head against his shoulder. Inside, they could hear laughter, conversation, the sounds of family and friends gathered in celebration. Outside, the sun slipped below the horizon, ending another day, beginning another evening, continuing the quiet rhythm of a life well lived. "Do you think it made a difference?" Martha asked. "Everything we've done, everything we've tried to do, did it change anything?" Harold considered the question. He thought about the families they'd helped avoid foreclosure, about the medical debts they'd erased, about the scholarships that had sent kids to college, about the shelter that now housed veterans with dignity. He thought about Susan Pritchard learning to apologize, about a town slowly recognizing the humanity it had overlooked, about the ripples spreading outward from one decision. To do the right thing, even when it would have been easier not to. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think it did. Maybe not everything, maybe not enough, but something. And something's better than nothing." As stars emerged in the darkening sky, Harold and Martha turned back toward their home, toward the warmth and light and love waiting inside. They'd traveled an impossible journey from poverty to wealth, from invisibility to recognition, from desperation to security. But the real journey, the one that mattered, was internal. They'd discovered that who you are when you have nothing is who you truly are. And no amount of money can change that for better or worse. They'd found a fortune buried beneath their feet. But the real treasure had been there all along. Integrity that couldn't be bought or sold. Dignity that couldn't be stripped away. Love that endured through everything. Those were the things worth holding on to, worth fighting for, worth building a life around. The rest was just paintings. Anyone can find fortune if they're lucky enough to break through the right wall at the right time. but staying true to who you are when that fortune appears. Choosing integrity over opportunity, valuing character over circumstances. That's the real discovery. That's what Harold and Martha found in that hidden room. Not paintings worth millions, but proof that they were worth something that no appraiser could value. They were people who did the right thing, even when no one would have known if they hadn't. And in the end, that was the legacy they left to Millbrook, to their children and grandchildren, to everyone who heard their story. Not wealth, though that helped people in tangible ways, but something more fundamental. The reminder that how we treat people when they're down, how we behave when no one's watching, who we choose to be when circumstances give us every excuse to be less. These are the things that truly define us. The rain shelter still stands on the edge of Millbrook, no longer a symbol of poverty but a monument to perseverance. The plaque Harold and Martha placed there tells their story simply. Here, two people found not treasure, but themselves. May all who enter find the same. Because sometimes the most valuable discovery isn't what's hidden in the walls. It's what's already inside us, waiting to be revealed when circumstances finally demand we show who we truly are. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories that will move you and restore your faith in humanity. Click now to continue this journey with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe character matters more than circumstances. If you believe integrity deserves to be rewarded. If you believe in the power of doing the right thing, even when it costs you everything.